Yeah.
You get
Yeah.
all this stuff, and it's like, wait, wait, wait. We are under final attack from a staunch, we're a family, and we
Yeah.
are under attack from a staunch enemy that's been trying to destroy us for 400 years. And if we don't get our shit together and come together and stand together as a family, we are going to lose.
Trained journalist, history expert, and combat photographer in Central America.
It was an illegal covert operation. It was one of the darkest moments of my life.
The Vietnamese admitted they had arrested Knight and Graham for violating the territory of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
The British government would not pay a ransom, would they? They don't pay official ransoms. They always make a thing of, we don't pay, otherwise it just happens again.
I was held for 11 months, and 7 of those I was in solitary confinement.
By the 17th of May 1984, Graham was free and returned to America. In the years that followed, Graham's thirst for adventure remained unquenched. He succeeded in working as a photojournalist, and also, ironically, for the CIA during the US war in El Salvador.
We have with us E.M. Burlingame. Now, E.M. has been in a variety of fields. He's a former Special Forces operator with the Green Berets. That was with the 10th Group. Is that correct, E.M.?
First and 20th.
First and 20th. So that was the 1st and 20th Special Forces group, and also in the investing, and has a very good understanding of the world as it plays. We've talked for quite a bit on a variety of subjects. And one of the things that I found very interesting is we talked about the idea of princes and politicians, which is the topic of this show today. So, Ian, why don't you break us into the idea of princes and politicians? And I call them the expendables versus the controllers. Why don't you lead us in on that?
Well, kind of a broad question, but in the book, The Eternal War I wrote, been looking at these things for over 40 years, right down to neuroscience levels.
Yep.
It seems to be that there's really only two hard and fast classes of peoples, and they seem to be genetically in every other way coded to this, and that's the responsibles on one side and the resentfuls on the other side. One motivated by sense of gratitude that leads to responsibility, and one motivated by a sense of envy that leads to resentment and malevolence and then evil if unchecked. In the middle is roughly 50% of the population that are adoptables, and they're somewhat resentful and somewhat responsible in different aspects of their life, or weighted heavily towards one side or the other. And you have princes that are on both ends of the spectrum, and you have princes that are adoptables in many ways. So it's not a hard and fast. In classical philosophy, psychology, power breakdown dynamics, the bureaucratic and political class falls under the priesthood.
Yeah.
So historically, these were the priests. And if you want the first prime example of this distinction, it was Akhenaten, King Tut's father, who took the capital out of Thebes, built an entire city called Amarna out on a bend of the river there on the Nile, and moved the capital from, in this case, it'd be like taking the capital from Washington, D.C. and putting it on the Missouri River somewhere, because the priesthood, which was the bureaucracy of the Egyptian empire, was so riddled through everything and so corrupt that it was enslaving the people to the people's detriment and destroying the kingdom, etc. So that's where the concepts and ideas of the priesthood being the bureaucrats, the bureaucracy, the deep state, etc., came from originally 4,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago. So, so you got both resentfuls and responsibles princes. You've got a whole bunch of adoptables back and forth. You have adoptable princes, which aren't really much of a prince. Maybe they have the wealth, maybe they have the title, authorities, power, etc., but they're not really much of a force in the world other than that they can be manipulated and controlled.
And that's the thing we're
And
looking at right here, and the idea that, okay, we're looking at, let's say, Elon Musk versus Donald Trump, which is interesting because on one level, Donald Trump is also a prince, but now he's becoming a politician, from what I'm interpreting on this. No.
no,
Okay.
no. So most politicians are actors.
Mm-hmm.
They're hired help.
Yeah, exactly.
They're the hired help. They're
Mm-hmm.
just actors. The real power, they don't have any real power at all.
Yep.
They're told
Yep.
what to do. The only decision that they kind of have is how much they'll sell themselves to which factions and which entities. That's really about the only power they have.
Yeah.
Give me a second. So historically, there are times when princes will step in to take the reins of power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's always a political process, even if you're a duke and you're in a monarchical system. And, excuse me, you're going to work your way into court and have authorities over certain titles and positions. You're still going to have to do politics to get there. You know, we have this illusion of election system, but it's still the old ancient model. We've just formalized it and made it more visible than how the way power works. But with respect to Trump, he's a lesser prince or a moderate prince, I would say, right? Because then again, in the monarchical aristocratic, actually, there's hierarchies. You know, you've got dukes and earls and viscounts and counts and marquises, well, marquis up here, and you've got barons and right. So you've got a whole skewing of not skewing, but a layering of greater and lesser princes. Well, it's the same today. It's just we have it now in the form of family offices.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's the principalities now, and you've got greater princes like Elon, who's the equivalent of a duke in wealth and a high a high level archduke, and then you've got Trump, who's in the lower billions, and that puts him in the the middle layer of the princes. You know, maybe in the old ways as a viscount, maybe. And then you've got the centimillionaires, but you even have some princes that are not even millionaires, but their family and their influence is quite substantive and quite powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean these people that fill CEO roles at companies, et cetera, because they're also the hired help.
Politicians, yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so that's kind of like a comparison, though, between, let's say, Biden, who was a flat out politician, and then you've got someone who's going back and forth between the prince and politician, which is Trump.
Well, you got to take the politician part out, right? There's princes that have to do politics to get into position, to have the support necessary to do the things they need to do once they're, in some position. So politicians who politic because they're just the hired help is fun. That's politics. That's a politician doing politician stuff.
Yeah.
When a prince steps into the political arena, they're not a politician. They're still a prince. They just got to play the political game to get into the position to do the work, meaning they need enough of the support of the people to enact their policies, the concepts and ideas of how do we fix these certain problems. So they aren't politicians. They don't become politicians. They just play the political game because that's required of the position. That's very different than somebody running for Congress or Senate or even Biden running for president who was installed. Not a prince.
And that's the key. And at the same time, being installed, it brings up the idea of expendable. And they're the ones who take the brunt. And they're put there
specifically because they're expendable.
It's exactly. And that's the thing that cycles through history is this constant, the face that's put to the public and then the real power that's behind that. And the reasoning of that, which is that when the people truly understand what's happening, they're trying to abate that by putting these politicians as the fodder up in front, so they themselves do not take the brunt of the rage and anger when the populace within an area revolts.
Well, people revolt because the system has become unsustainable and too abusive. And the pattern, to what you're saying, the pattern going back thousands and thousands of years, even in monarchical systems, even in imperial systems, is the real powers, the real princes, the real powers, the merchants and merchant systems, the bankers, et cetera, put in and sometimes for 2 generations will put incompetence in positions of power and authority. And you have to do it for at least 20 years for it to be a valid argument. So that when the system when the reset finally comes and the pain has to be borne of that reset, well, I'm not guilty of that. I didn't do that. Never mind 20 years ago, 40 years ago, like in the GFC or in the dot-com collapse, et cetera. Never mind 20, 30 years ago, we stole everything. Right. And it's been on a steady momentum ever since till, that momentum drops off. Force equals mass times velocity equals force times mass, right? And the mass is gone, the force is gone, so the velocity drops. So point being is that after the steal, after the enslavement, you have to put incompetence in all these different positions to make all these different mistakes that makes it look like they're the reason when the whole thing comes to a stop, that it's their fault. When no, it was the steal that happened, and the misuse of power that happened 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And in this case, realistically, the Great Steal, quite despite the several since, happened in 1971 when we defaulted and went off the gold standard. And we created the fiat currency. The truth of the matter is that Great Steal happened then. There's just been follow-on events in the 80s, late 90s, early 2000s, then again in 2007, 2008, and then the COVID, et cetera. But the real steal, the real theft was set in motion in 1971 with the default, which was masked under the moving from the gold standard to fiat currency. And we've had steadily, and if just look who they put in the presidency that they could control, and the first one that they can't control is Trump. So they tried to kill him.
Well, if you go back, it actually goes to Nixon because they got rid of him.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Well, when was that? 1970s, right? So they were setting this deal up starting the 1940s and through the 1960s. Kennedy called it out, and there's that speech Kennedy gave a couple of weeks before he was killed about there's, shadow forces, et cetera. He wasn't talking about communism. He wasn't talking about the communists. Kennedy and the princes tried, the responsible princes tried to stop it then. So they killed him. And then they put in, Johnson in position who was aligned with them. He probably was involved. And
profited, heavily.
And then it's just been a steady succession. Reagan tried to stand up to him when he realized what was going on with the Iran-Contra, so they shot him too. And then his tone changed. Right? So you're absolutely right. The pattern is that they put incompetence in positions increasingly in all these different positions. They stir up the Marxists to go too far. They support the Marxists because they're just insane to be insane at every level. And then it all gets blamed on them. Never mind that the theft, the great theft, excuse me, the great enslavement for 3 or 4 generations out because of the amount of debt has already occurred and had nothing to do with the incompetence. They were just unable to stop it. And that's the second piece I've talked about numerous times is people who are in positions of power and authority when criminal, illegal things happen, make sure that the person that replaces them in that position of authority is dumber than they are, so that they'll never work out and are beholden to who put them in that position of power, so that the fraud, the corruption, the theft, the whatever it is, doesn't get called out. Well, what happens over 2 or 3 generations of that, and 4 or 5 generations, and because these people are only in the job 2 to 5 years, maybe 10 years. So for 3 or 4 generations is only 10, 15, 20 years, right? 30 years, 40 years. By the time you get 3 or 4 of those out, where they just put dumber people into dumber people and dumber people, you wind up with retards at the top of most institutions and organizations who think they're smart and brilliant because they're in a position of power. It has nothing to do with them. It's just the institution.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I'm seeing this across the board. It's not only with the leadership, because your leadership
management. You got to have it all the way down to management.
It's the whole population.
No.
And this whole thing about with Trump removing the Department of Education, I vividly remember having gone to private school in Singapore in the 70s, arriving in California for my sophomore year. I went through 2 years pre-Department of Education. And right when that Department of Education came in, I noticed by my end of my junior year and my senior year, what a difference it was to the previous, and how many teachers disappeared. Teachers, and that's for my generation, because then having conversations with my father, who was educated in the 30s and the 40s, asking me about things he was surprised that I was getting as an elective, like critical thinking in university. That was required class in high school.
Yeah, logic. Yeah.
It's just wild. And so you see the plane, you see the way they've been dumbing down the populace, and then from the populace, you pull these expendables, these politicians, who are going to be fodder for when whatever's coming, if it comes. We've been having conversations about that. I say 6 to 12 months. You say 18 months. And why do you say 18 months? What has to happen before people finally totally recognize as a mass? And also, one of the things I never asked you about that is, do you think it's global? I think it's going to be global, like every country, and you see that in every country. For instance, in the UK, people talking about civil war in the UK since the 1500s. All these different other countries, you've already seen a revolution happen in Sri Lanka as a result of the politicians, the stupids, who were allowing what they allowed in Sri Lanka to happen.
Yeah,
so
that's again, the politicians took the fall for it, but that wasn't who set that problem in motion. I just had a call this morning with an associate in Ireland. The folks that have done the Great Steal will not allow this to go to total collapse. Because, and they won't allow it to go beyond a certain point, because then they're actually at no shit risk themselves. And they're not stupid either. They've studied history and collapses, and their forebears have been involved in some of that, et cetera. So they're not going to allow it to go to collapse. Now, what they do need to do is because they want total and absolute control of their citizens, because we're going to have to go through either a fundamentally hard reset of our economic system, and or we're going to have to go through 2 to 3 generations of stagnation as we work through debt and population decline, et cetera, which go hand in hand. Because if people in the early 20s can't earn a sufficient living, they don't have kids. Once they get out of their 20s, it gets harder and harder to have kids, for women in particular, but men as well. In order to bring about totalitarian control, the totalitarian tech state, you have to create chaos and violence and fear in communities in your own countries, even in remote communities. But you don't want that to go far enough to where it could actually blow into something to where it would actually get a revolution-like response in your own people, and or could lead to a Syria-like collapse of legitimacy, such that the bad guys, the actual violent, on the intelligence community payroll guys, gain the upper hand, because now you're in danger and your assets are in danger. So what do? Well, you steadily up the pressure till you drive the people into a state, just like the Patriot Act, et cetera, but now 100 times more that, to where the people are willing to allow an absolute domination, totalitarian observation, intelligence state, police state, while also stirring up genuine ethnic fear and rage that the state itself deals with, in the form of, if they can get it, in the form of ushering all these people into the camps to die as slave labor in the forced reindustrialization of your countries.
Mm-hmm.
In order to go to what you have to do in order to go to war with whomever enemy. And oh, never mind, you're building up that enemy at the same time.
Yeah.
Because this is what Germany did in the 1920s and 30s, backed by Wall Street, backed by the city of London.
Mm-hmm.
That's how Germany, we look at Dachau, Buchenwald, and the others, and the ovens and the slaughter of the Jews. But why isn't people talk about what those really were and what they were for a decade before that, which was labor camps?
Yeah.
Right. Let's talk about how Germany reindustrialized BMW, Volkswagen, all of these companies.
Cheap labor.
Right.
Yeah. Cheap labor.
It was slave labor. And it was, there's two types of slave labor. There's one where you reinvest in the slaves so that you have productive, multi-year productive labor.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another form of slavery where you just use them up at the lowest cost possible and then dump their bodies in mass graves.
Yeah.
That's what Germany did.
Yeah.
And they're not the only ones, right? So that pattern is out there, that model's out there, and to think, well, it couldn't happen. That doesn't happen. It happened in Germany, one of the most advanced nations in the world in the last century.
Mm-hmm.
Not in, Germany wasn't some third world country. It had the top universities in the world, the top philosophy departments, the top law schools, all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So when you ask about the 18 to 36 months, they haven't gotten the population. They've been delayed a bit now too, because their cash flow's been turned off with USAID, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
But they're sitting on $30-40 trillion in offshore wealth.
Mm-hmm.
That they've got way more than enough funds, and they're bringing in $600 billion to $1 trillion a year in trafficking revenues.
Yeah.
So they're way more than enough capitalized and have way more than enough liquidity to fund this for 30-40 years.
Mm-hmm.
So they haven't quite gotten people. They haven't quite gotten the state conditions. Syria is part of it. That was a key piece. The stuff that's coming out now, the murders of Christians and Alawites and all that's all part of it. They feed that out there. I don't quite understand. I mean, I do on one level, which gets real dark real quick, but this whole movement to, if you say anything against the Jews in any way, you're anti-Semitic and the whole state could be brought down on you.
Yeah.
What that is to me is they're channelizing the rage, they're channelizing the fear and the rage, and they're making sure that it doesn't, because they want it directed against a specific people, and those people aren't the Jews. And so that's why all this, crackdown on anything that might be considered to be anti-Semitic. Because as we've already seen, and I hear it stupidly, but I hear it. I post some comment about somebody behind something, and there's invariably 3 or 4 people that jump in and say the Jews, right? So when do you want to channelize rage and hate against the Islamic world and the cartels and the South and Central Americans? You got to make sure that that rage doesn't get shunted off to the Jews.
So are you saying that you think that in the ways that the Germans used as a focal point the Jewish population, it's now being the Islamic and the cartels?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the undesirables list is still the undesirables list. Down underneath this is still eugenicism,
Yeah.
right? Or eugenics, excuse me.
Eugenics.
Right? Behind this is, well, I won't go that far in a public forum, but it's estrogen behind it. Estrogen is genocidal because estrogen drives genetic warfare at every level, always, everywhere. So the undesirables list is still the undesirables list. They say people that won't allow this, they may not get a choice, but won't allow this to get out of control such that they're in danger. These same people want all these people dead.
Yeah.
Racism is very real and it goes very deep and it's very powerful. It's just not the weak, petty little white supremacist idiots that, you know what I mean? Those are idiots.
Yeah.
The real racism is really deep and really powerful and really rather ugly when it gets out of control. Right? When it's allowed free reign. The Nazis didn't just kill Jews. Gypsies, Poles, Slavs, right?
Yeah. Catholics. I mean,
Catholics. Well, they can kill the Catholics for all I care. No. But I say that tongue in cheek, the Catholic one. But I mean, there's factions with the Catholics we're dealing with as well. The Catholics are a big part of flooding Catholics into the country to change the ethnic demographics so that the Roman Catholic Empire, which is Rome 2.0, has power here in the United States.
Well, it floored me because, people say that they're American, but then I've been following this guy, was it Michael, O'Keefe out of Ireland? And it's like, he actually flat out says, are you Irish or are you American? And it's like people responding from Boston, I'm Irish first. And I'm like, that'd be like me saying I'm Scottish first. And that would be so insane. Because
but I don't necessarily agree with that, though. I don't actually necessarily agree with that. And I think that's a problem.
What's that?
I think, well, one of the things that I'm getting pushback fairly well from some people, but I believe what's actually made America so vulnerable is that we don't accept the fact that whether we're Welsh, Scottish, Irish, English, that we are all members of the English civilization.
As an origin.
There is no, as an origin.
That we have, and that's not happening. What you're seeing is that hyphenation, and that's what.
Yeah, and so it's okay
of the country. Yeah,
if you're a member of your civilization, if you're Irish or Scottish or Welsh or right. It's not about. So again, there's no such thing as an Englishman ethnically, right? There's no such thing as an ethnic Englishman.
Yeah.
Right. So. At the time when Alfred the Great was pulling this, really codified our civilization, the beginning of our civilization built on 3 principles: individual sovereignty, the right to private property, and the balance of power.
Yeah.
Right. When that was happening and he was doing that, he was pulling and codifying the first laws, translating everything into Old Frisian, which is Old English. Right. At the time, what was he doing? He was assembling a civilization out of a group of peoples that were Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Frisians, Danes, Picts, Celts, Gales, Scotti, right? Britannies, right? So the English civilization from its very beginning is an amalgam of peoples and cultures. But what Alfred the Great did by intentionally devising and putting together the best of these into the English civilization, which finally came about fully under his grandson, Athelstan,
Mhm.
was a melding of the best of these peoples into a single whole. That was 1,100 years ago, 1,200
Yeah.
years ago. Look what
Yeah.
our civilization has
Yeah.
done since,
Yeah.
right?
And if you
So
look at it, that's a precursor to America, which is these peoples came together and quote, it became England, became Britain, and then it became America, and
all the
America,
colonies, exactly.
and it was like that for the longest time until I first started seeing, I think maybe in the 90s, I started seeing hyphenation. I never saw hyphenations until about the early 90s, late 80s, which is African American, Chinese American, Asian American. Before
Hispanics.
then, and I would actually get into conversations just in high school and say, so, where are your people from? And they would automatically say, I'm an American. I'm an American. There isn't any like, I'm from Vietnam. I said, I'm an American, but my family came from.
The old country.
People used to say that. They don't say that anymore. Now it's like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm Irish American, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. So here's the interesting, so very, again, English civilization is an amalgam of peoples.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to be English?
Mhm.
Doesn't mean you're an ethnic an ethnic English, because that doesn't exist. What does it
Exactly.
mean?
Yeah.
You are someone that was born into or who was an immigrant from another part of the world that adheres to the three core principles of the English civilization
Mm-hmm.
and to the common law that was developed to support and protect that, and to
Exactly.
constitutionality, because that's
Exactly.
the Magna Carta,
Yeah.
etc. So you can be from Sri Lanka, you could
Mhm.
be from Madagascar, you could be from, I mean, ethnically so, you
Yeah.
could be from India, you could be from Nepal, Bhutan, etc.,
Exactly.
and be English.
Mhm.
You want a prime example of that? The Gurkhas
Yeah, exactly.
from Nepal.
Exactly.
You could
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
English because you resonate and adhere. And it used to be, very much to your point, that up until about 40 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, people immigrated here from around the world, and some still do, the ones that do it the right way,
Mhm.
because they want to be part of the English civilization,
Yeah.
which its peak expression and codification is the United States.
Yeah.
Right? We are
Yeah.
the keepers of the English civilization now, the most dominant force in it.
Exactly.
But this identity fracturing, this denial of ourselves as a civilization, that the English even are a civilization, started in the 1600s.
Mhm.
It started in what would become the United Kingdom,
Mhm.
when we were steadily being infiltrated at the top, and we had traders in our own, where the three principles upon which English civilization were being eroded, which led to the English Civil War, led to
Yeah.
Cromwell, who actually tried to restore them. But after Cromwell, it couldn't be held. They put a puppet Charles II on the throne. And then in 1688, they brought a European over from
Mhm.
Denmark, William of Orange, and put him
Yeah.
on the throne in a constitution. So the English-speaking peoples from the 1600s have been steadily denied the reality that we are a civilization. And we've been increasingly forced to look to Europe as the Western, that we are of Western civilization. No, we're not. We fought the Western civilization, continental peoples, for 1,000 years to not be like them.
Exactly.
Right? Yes, we
Exactly.
respect the Greeks and the Romans. Got
Yeah.
it. But we're not French. We're not
Yeah.
Germans.
Yeah.
We fought those people, and the people that came to before the 1600s, et cetera, who came to what were the British Isles, who came to the colonies, et cetera, were people who wanted to be English. They
Yeah.
didn't want to live as French and Germans, et cetera. Now, it doesn't mean they give up their culture and et cetera, but they didn't want to fall under they wanted the freedoms and the rights and balance of power that we have as English, and the English civilization, which is unique in the world in this as its fundamental core. And then not only that, we're the only civilization in human history that spent 2 centuries fighting slavery.
Yeah.
And spent immense amount of treasure and lives doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree.
So, EM, let's talk about something that I've actually had a question about, which is there is an English or British English civilization. Is there an American civilization?
Great question. Uh, the short answer is no,
Okay. Why is that?
because we are English to
Hmm.
our core, riddled through everything, absolutely everything. We are English, even with the enrichment, and I do mean this, the enrichment of legal immigrants that we've had over the last century, century and a half.
Hmm.
We've remained staunch participants and benefactors and keepers of the English civilization. Hell, we went to war in Europe for 2 world wars and fought a Cold War, et cetera, as defenders of the English civilization. The United States wasn't threatened, right? America wasn't threatened in either one of those.
Exactly.
Even with that bee sting that we allowed to happen, no disrespect to those who lost their lives, but the bee sting of Pearl Harbor, we weren't
Hmm.
really threatened.
Yeah. And it was a
Um,
setup too. Yeah.
and it was probably a setup. All the evidence points to that.
Hmm.
Now, the longer answer is, and I've written on this several times on Twitter, is that should America get through this current fight over the balance of power, because that's what we're heading into, or that's what we're involved already,
Hmm.
and the power be restored to the princes and the people and taken away from the priests, the bankers, the industrialists, the
Yeah.
parliamentarians, the financiers, etc.
And why do you call the quote, I always refer to them as the international bankers, but you call them the priests. Why do you call them the priests?
Because they're a religion. Money is a religion.
Yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
When you value everything in money and art and status and artificial status hierarchies, that's a religion.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's adhered to as a religion.
I understand that.
And it has its high priest, and the high priests are the big financiers, the Ray Dalios
Yeah.
and the Jamie Dimons, and
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And then you've got the lower level priests, the bureaucrats, and the institutionalists, et cetera. But it's a religion. This
Hmm.
whole concept of money is made out of whole cloth,
Yeah.
right? This whole concept of financialization, it's magic. It's
Hmm.
it's it's a religion.
Yeah.
And it's adhered to like that. And the religion was put in place and fought over for 300-400 years. So what happened in the Wars of the Rose, or not the War of the Roses, the 80 years, 100 years, and 30 years wars?
Yeah.
Christianity was defeated
Hmm.
and replaced with this new religion, this financialist religion,
Now, this is going to be hard
economic
for people to
religion.
truly put their head around. I totally get it as you're telling me this, and as you're describing it, because of the idea between a spiritual connection between a person and quote a God in their beliefs in their personal belief system, then the regulation of religion,
Yes.
and that's the thing that's
It's supplanted.
it supplanted it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's just wild. Yeah,
Yeah. And everything
wow.
since then is an
Yeah,
extension of that, right?
yeah,
It's extension of it. Right down to the removal of natural law from the practice of law,
yeah, yeah,
right? You had to
yeah.
remove the last vestige of Christianity, the last vestige of original, even pre-Christian belief systems from the practice of law, even
Mhm.
common law.
Yeah.
And you
And
had to
that's
make it
affected
about
us here in the
money.
United States.
Well, that's
It-
why we have a
yeah.
two-tiered legal system.
That's just so wild because it's like the founding fathers, they created our legal system initially, which is all defined in our Constitution to be very simple. So you did not need a barrister. You did not need a lawyer in order to represent yourself. But now you
Correct.
do, because
But it
just
had
like
to be
in the church.
correct.
Just
Correct.
wild.
Correct. So
Wow.
we have
Interesting.
all these priests, and these
Yeah.
priests preach in all these different ways the religion of money, the religion of finance,
Yeah. Yeah.
and it's enslaved everybody.
Yeah.
And it's destroyed everybody and it's driven everybody insane because there's no reality to it. It is all layers and layers and layers, 700 layers of derivatives,
Huh.
financial derivatives of surreality.
Interesting. Very interesting. Now you write about this in your book, in your
I
books?
haven't, this one, articulating this clearly is literally just, this is the first time, but
Huh.
because you asked the question. So I've alluded to it in all these things.
Mm-hmm.
But I do actually in the Eternal War do allude to this as a religion, as you know, the Eternal War is this new religion that supplanted
Yeah.
Christianity. Christianity, you know, for all intents and purposes, and not and in absolute reality, Christianity lost the religious wars
Yeah.
in Europe from the 12th century through the early 16th century or 17th century. So from the 13th century into the early 17th century, so 1200s into the 1600s,
Mhm.
Christianity was destroyed and supplanted by this financialist religion that's been in
Wow.
control of everything and was coded into law and into practice across Europe in the two treaties, Innsbruck and Munster, 1645,
Mhm.
1649,
Mhm.
collectively known as the Peace of Westphalia, and then attempted with the parliamentarian seizing control and beheading the king or removing the king. And then Cromwell tried to prevent it, tried to stop it from happening, but ultimately in 1688, it was instantiated in the United Kingdom, this new
Huh.
religion as the formal religion of the state, right?
Wow. Interesting.
And
Yeah.
it's steadily in supplant. And if you look at it in that context, you can see the steady decline of Christianity. The martial capacities of Christianity were destroyed in 300, 400 years of nonstop war.
Mhm.
Done. And it exhausted people, and they didn't want that anymore. And it's become uh, well, anyways, not to belabor a point, but back to the original question. No, the United States, there is no American civilization yet. However, given what's happened with the United Kingdom, the heart of the civilization, the homeland of the civilization, which is beyond redemption at this point,
Yeah.
unless the United States rides to the rescue, not in Europe, we got to let them deal with themselves, but
Mhm.
you know, rides home and restores the islands to its native peoples.
Mhm.
Short of that, the United Kingdom's done.
Yeah.
Commonwealth's mostly done.
Totally. Mhm.
Um, what could happen, and I've written about this, is that the United States could emerge out of the British, you know, the English. I don't want to say the English because we'll never get rid of or lose the English civilization. It's the core and root of everything.
Mhm.
It's what the Constitution is. The Constitution is a more sophisticated, more thorough telling of the Magna Carta. And
And
people
that's the
argue that
key.
all they want.
People try to say that it's the Magna Carta was the first constitution. It's not. It's the origin. It's the ideas that then, as you're saying, were
Correct.
fine-tuned to represent the
Correct.
people as compared to the
Correct. The
barons. Yeah.
Magna Carta was
Mhm.
the formal documentation of the English civilization,
Yeah.
of the three principles:
Yeah.
individual sovereignty,
Hmm.
right to private property, and the sharing and balance of power
Yeah.
between the people, the princes, and the priests,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Government writ large.
Yeah.
So give me a second. The United States could emerge as a civilization out of the United Kingdom, out of Britain, right? What
Yeah.
would be called Britain much later,
Yeah.
just as Constantinople and the Byzantines emerged out of Rome.
Hmm.
To the very end, the Byzantines considered themselves Roman, but they Hellenized themselves. They spoke Greek predominantly. They didn't speak Latin.
Huh.
They reconnected with a much older root, which in this case might be, you know, Gaelic, Celtic, you know, the older historical traditional roots of the peoples that make up the English speaking civilization.
Yeah.
Will we would be the keepers of the English civilization, but greatly enhanced, greatly updated, paired away with a lot of the ugliness and stuff, going back to the original. At some point, we And again, this is only going to happen if we survive and if we remember that we are English. We need to stop. We're not going to be able to create an identity out of whole cloth. It doesn't work that way. And we don't need to. We have an identity that's over 1,000 years old. It's been tested and tried and proven and beaten up and reshaped and reformed, right? It's done things for the world, contributed to the world in ways no other civilizations have ever done.
Yeah.
At least no other modern civilization in the last 2,000 years or, 1,000 years, right? So as of right now, no, we're not a civilization because one, we've been denied as an English speaking people, denied the concept and idea or the recognition that we are a civilization.
Yeah.
Right. That's first. And that's been steadily done by continental Europeans and the parasites in our own countries that have been trying to be like Europeans for that parasitism, that type of parasitism.
Exactly.
And control and to spread that religion, right? To do that, you have to deny people their recognition that they're English, that they are members of the English civilization. Well, how do you do that initially? You get the Scots to fight the Irish to fight the English to fight the Welsh. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You get all this stuff, and it's like, wait. We are under final attack from we're a family, and we are under attack from a staunch enemy that's been trying to destroy us for 400 years. And if we don't get our shit together and come together and stand together as a family, we are going to lose. We can go back to hating each other later. We can go back to remembering the Battle of 1642 and you know what I mean? And the Cromwell's invasions, and we can remember when the Scots, killed the Northumbrians, and we can go back to all this stuff later, being a dysfunctional family later. But we are a family, and we need to come together. If we can do that, then yes, I do believe if the United States stays together, reconnects with its roots, reconnects with natural law, Christianity's done. It's never going to be that unifying force again. It died 400 years ago. But the English civilization, a civilization isn't religion dependent. It's religion independent, which is why all this push to religions, right?
Yeah.
A civilization is religion and ethnic independent. And we have to reconnect with that. If we can do that and we can stay whole, that will get us through the conflicts that we're now upon, prevent them from tearing us all apart, allow us to improve upon that civilization and update it again, which has to happen like every 400 years, and we're right there. We update that civilization again. America goes on to become the keepers of the English civilization, and it does become, like the Byzantines, a culture and civilization that goes on for maybe another 500,000 years.
Yeah. With the implosion that's occurring in Europe, and a lot of most of it's economic driven to the point that it's like they're so chomping at the bit to get into a war. Any war will do just to get them out of where I see them just totally imploding economically. What do you see happening? It seems almost like the torch has been the English civilization torch has been brought to America, and we're also being attacked in America too, where they're trying to, I mean, the whole idea that I was really impressed with Trump when he made English the national language, which that should never have been a question because of what the Constitution was written in originally. I mean, I'm half Hispanic, I'm half Ecuadorian. Why didn't they do that in South America? I always get in these conversations with South Americans. I just had one with an Argentine. I said, do you know why Simon Bolivar was crying in his later years? He was crying because he knew that South America would never unite. It could never unite just because of the fractionation. And because of that, could never be as strong and as great as the United States. That's what's so amazing about the United States having become unified as a country in contrast to South America.
Because we're English.
Yeah.
We're English.
Yeah.
And give me a second. We are a civilization. South and Central Americans are not. South and Central Americans.
And there's no Spanish civilization either. There's no Spanish civilization.
There was.
What was that though? What was it though? Was it Roman?
No.
Of origin?
Okay, so actually, you know what? You're absolutely right. a Spanish civilization, while it had every opportunity, didn't actually formally shape up and emerge.
Exactly.
You're absolutely
Exactly.
right.
Yeah.
You're
Yeah.
absolutely right. If it had, then the Spanish-speaking world would be members of that civilization.
Exactly.
I'll-
Exactly.
you're absolutely right. That gets to another point that's very critical, and I'm grateful for the correction. You can have very wealthy and powerful kingdoms and empires that don't develop into a civilization.
Great. Yeah. Yeah.
And the reason is that by their very nature, civilizations have to have at their core a certain degree of individual freedoms and
Yes.
rights.
Yes.
They
Yes.
have to. If
Yes.
you look at Chinese, the only two other real civilizations
Yeah.
that are still powers in the world. Now, the Persians are a civilization, but they're not a power in the world, not a real power. Not to say that they don't have power projection, but the only other two real civilizations extant today are the Russians and the Chinese. And while we talk about totalitarianism and all this, that's total and absolute bullshit. It's projection by the people try to keep us from, keep us all apart. Very same peoples.
Yeah.
If you look at Russian civilization, if you look at Chinese civilization, while it's had totalitarian moments, like the communist, more totalitarian than any emperor or czar ever imagined, even Ivan himself.
Yeah.
At the core of Russian and Chinese civilization, just as the English civilization, though in different ways, are freedoms.
But I don't see
actual-
that, having been raised in Asia, I don't see the freedoms that the Russians as an identity have in contrast to the Chinese people.
Okay, so
There's two different, those freedoms are very
you were also
unique.
there. You were also in Asia when China was communist and coming out the end of its communist period. So we can't look to China right now, although China is becoming more Chinese. What I call the Hong Dynasty, right? The Red Dynasty is becoming more China. And I called this in China 2003, I think, in a conversation with very wealthy people at the time. I was like, this is what, because they were belaboring, right? They were concerned with the future of China. I said, don't worry about it. Every dynasty that comes in, 50 to 80 years after the dynasty comes in, everything settles down. They become more Chinese than the previous dynasties before.
Oh, yeah.
And
You see that now in terms of actually the treatment of non-Chinese, which has not been good for those who are living in China now.
Yeah.
It's almost like a backlash to 10 years ago, 15 years ago. There was more open. I noticed that in Korea too, where it's like, thank you for helping us against the North. And then by the time I got there, it was like a girl had been killed by a tank, run over by a tank. And it's like, why are these Americans still here? You're separating us from our brothers in the North. And you totally ignore what happened.
Well,
that
was also stimulated by other things and other forces as well, that whole fight to begin with. So to your point, though, about Russia and China, Far East Asians are communitarian. They're
village oriented.
They've lived in such high density population densities that they've had to develop in different ways, culturally, socially, than we in the West, which have had a lot more territory, a lot more space, a lot more room.
Like in Russia. In Russia, they're more closer to us than
that. Well, that's what I was just going to say. Russians and Americans are very much alike. And by the way, there wouldn't be in America if it wasn't for the Russians.
Exactly.
Because Catherine the Great used the Russian fleets and influence to keep others out of our little kerfluffle with our parents back in London. And both in the 1700s, in the Revolutionary War, and then again in 1812 and after. So yes, so the point being is that when you have, in order for Russia to stay together despite the invasions of the Mongols, despite the invasions of the French, the Germans, the yada, that you can't have a totalitarian state and have that kind of support from the people in an area that's spread out.
Yeah.
You can't. You have to have willing support of the people. Well, how do you, and this is the same in America, which they've been trying to destroy, the cities and et cetera. But the only way in which and this is the way it was in the British Isles before they became heavily populated, etc. The only way you have the willing support of rural peoples is you have to develop into a civilization around certain rights and freedoms that the princes and the kings will fight for.
Yeah. Yes.
They'll fight one another for,
Mm-hmm.
right? And where
Yeah.
it went wrong is we let this religion, this financialist religion, this new finance-backed or finance money-oriented religion
Mm-hmm.
get into all these positions of power and then tear down all of the tradition, destroy the princes economically, financially, displace them by, creating artificial wealth.
Well,
That the
also
princes,
creating fronts, making it look like they're of the people, but again, they're not of the people, like Lenin,
yeah,
who's
see,
coming from a
we're
wealthy family. And, having read Pawns in the Game by William Guy Carr, that I recommend everybody read, he labels it as the World Revolutionary Movement, which incorporates socialism, communism, Marxism, all these different fronts that are
they're
created
just they're
specifically to break everything up.
they're sex what socialism in all of its forms is,
Yeah.
which does include Nazism and fascism,
Yeah.
etc. Which Nazism and Marxism are basically the same thing. They have a different approach,
Mm-hmm.
and they're both resentfuls. But
Yeah.
all of that is part of the same religion, the
Yeah.
same financialist religion that was put in place, instantiated in the 1600s.
Yeah.
And and the only counter to that religion is strong princes with strong bonds and connections to their people, mutually beneficial, multi-generational bonds.
It's interesting that as we're talking right now, I just realized that these movements
Those are
focused
sects
and
within it.
used they use the workers, but I'm a farmer, and because of my independence as a farmer, when everybody else was complaining about egg prices, I'm going, well, yeah, well, that doesn't affect us because we get eggs all the time. But if you're a worker, you're heavily affected, and you're affected by that religion of money,
Yes.
of
Yes.
not real money, of fiat currency.
Financialism. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Financialism. Everything's
Yeah.
financialized. So the Marxist and fascist Nazis, they're just sects within the financialist religion.
Yeah.
They're not separate from, they're not independent from.
Yeah.
They're just sects within the financialist religion.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And in
Huh.
order for the religion to go, the high priest, the pope of it, I don't know who the hell that would be, but the bishops, the cardinals of the
Yeah.
financialist religion,
Yeah.
they just kind of feed one sect for a time and feed another sect for a time, and right, and then
Well,
kind
these
of
are like,
back off
when
for
you're
a
talking
time.
about like the priests, it would be like the Bilderbergs and the Rothschilds and all of them. And people say, oh, it's all the Rothschilds. Says, no, there's somebody before the Rothschilds, way before the
Well,
Rothschilds.
no,
And they
the
jumped in
Rothschilds
on it.
are,
Yeah.
and Rothschilds are also just one of many.
One of many.
And
Yeah.
the Rothschilds as Jews are the whipping boys.
Yeah. And they've created, they have their own, that's that anti-Semitic thing that it gets played. And so it gets people to focus on the Jewish when it's actually the Rothschilds who are using their own people and throwing them under the bus.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and people say, oh, with the Zionism, it's this, they don't even care about Israel either. It's all about this religion.
It's all about the religion.
Yeah, of finance. It's the finance religion.
Correct.
And now they're pushing us over. So they're trying to remove us from true wealth, which originally would be the egg, which would be the land, which would be being the farmer.
No. The real economy.
Yeah.
The real economy is mutually beneficial relationships that cross many generations. All those other things are things that we do to feed and house and support one another.
Yeah.
The real wealth, right? The real wealth of nations is the relationships and the bonds, the organic status hierarchies in which people live and thrive. It's the relationships. This whole concept and idea of this or that or this or that is words and concepts and ideas that have been given to us by the financialist religion and the priests thereof. Historically, what did we value? And even now in some rural communities and other parts of the world, what do they value?
Yeah.
The relationships.
Yeah.
I owe this to
within a
that
house, within a
person.
village, within
Correct,
yeah.
correct. Between villages.
And then you don't have ownership actually of the land because the land is used by the village and the community.
We're just occupying it now. Now
We're,
maybe
yeah, just
somebody has
occupying it. Yeah.
somebody has responsibility for
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And that's codified maybe in a title or a deed or whatever, or in a family office. You have
Yeah.
responsibility for it. And I've said this for 30 years now. Except for those who are, you know, deep practitioners of the financialist religion,
Mm-hmm.
those that have wealth that's based off of real assets and relationships and the productivity of those relationships, which does get denoted in monetary when transactions have to happen, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
Those people, when you talk to them, they don't say it exactly this way, but they to a person recognize that they are only stewards of the relationships and the productivity of those relationships for as long as they're alive and as long as they're capable. They're just shepherds. They are the individuals that, even though great responsibility denoted in the financialist frickin', we wouldn't used to not do that. We didn't codify these things in dollars and cents. We codified them in that title.
Mm-hmm.
And the responsibilities up and down and across for somebody of that title.
Yeah.
And
now,
then it's the organic status hierarchies, right? And all their complexity.
Now, to give people, the listeners, the practicality of dealing with something like this. I mean, I know my practicality, which is back in 2008. I paid attention to the heads up, that's when I started my plan to get back to Alaska, where I had previously been able to live as a hunter and subsistence fisherman while I wrote my first book. With the idea that this time, even for more security, farming and ranching, if people are looking at, let's say, your timeline versus my timeline, whatever the timeline might be, let's say it's the 18 to 36, what are the suggestions in terms of getting ready for something like that? Because the reason I'm saying that now, and people should be paying attention, that I'm paying attention because I pay attention to gold, which is during Trump's first administration, because of how you had trust going back into the fiat currency of the dollar, the gold price went down to 538. And I wish I'd been paying attention to that, because I would have just gone straight up to Nome and bought a bunch of it, right off the beach. And now it's hovering at 3 and getting ready to go higher. So that's the disparity between the previous administration and the second administration under Trump. So that to me is an indicator of how this is going to continue to play out, because the train was set, like we were saying, about 30, 40 years ago.
So everything you just articulated is the words and language and concepts of the financialist religion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's how they want you to think about troubles and times, etc.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In their concepts, their words, their religion, their those things which are going to benefit the cardinals at the top of that religion.
Mm-hmm.
And the priest of. I don't think about it that way at all. I'm not stockpiling gold. I'm not doing any of that, because guess what?
Mm-hmm.
There's a guy, Gammon, who's got that show Rebel Capitalist.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
He did an interesting test run of the use of gold to travel down through South and Central America and pay for everything in gold and crypto, and it failed totally and utterly because nobody knows what to do with it.
It's not for that. It's not for that. Yeah.
But that's what people are thinking, is if we go to failure, that you're going to start shaving off gold and you're going to, no, it doesn't work that way.
No.
Here's here's where we're still playing in their reality by
Yeah.
even having that conversation.
Yeah.
To your question, I would have skills that are of value in a local community: blacksmithing,
Yeah.
metalworking,
Yeah.
machining,
Yeah.
repair,
Yeah.
service,
Yeah.
right? I would have hard skills that I was able to provide, the making of butter, simple
Mhm.
things that are life sustaining. I'd know how to fight. I'd
Yeah.
know how to defend. I'd know how to protect. I'd know how to, you know what I mean? So,
But what about the people who've put the money down and bought the land on which you would actually go to ask the person who owns that land, can I have a little bit of here to work for you?
okay, so have skills for that person needs. That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
What I'm exactly saying is, okay, there are people that have large tracts of land. There are
Yeah.
people that have places you can go and you can have this is also for the high net worth people who own these tracts of land, et cetera. Know who to bring onto your land.
Yeah.
Provide some commons that people can live off of. The quid pro quo there is they're going to defend it,
Yeah.
and they're going to
Yeah.
defend you
Yeah.
if and when. And you think your high powered, high paid fucking security companies are going to protect you? They all come from
Yeah.
the government in one
Yeah.
form or fashion.
They're
And
going to take it over. They're going to take it
Well,
over.
that's exactly right. That's
Yeah.
my friend Clay Martin said.
Yeah.
Um, and they're not loyal to you. That doesn't matter the paycheck. Their families could be held hostage, or you know
Yeah.
what I mean? They
Yeah.
could even be good guys. You have no idea. So
Yeah.
the only way historically that anybody has real power is, one, you stop thinking in the language and the text and the Bible of the financialist religion.
Mhm.
And that's hard to do because it's in
Yeah.
everything,
Yeah.
everything for 400 years.
Yeah.
It's displaced everything. So you got to get out of that. You got to get back to, okay, how am I actually secure?
Mhm.
Okay, well, you need to have certain things that continue to work
Yeah.
and certain functions that continue to happen. And you can't go to the big box guys because the logistics chains are broken down, or it's just not safe to do so. So you're going to need human beings in your local area. Well, what do they need? How can we help provide that with our largesse?
Mhm.
And the honest truth is, you need to restore the commons.
Yeah.
You have to restore the commons and then allow people to participate in the commons that are actually contributing overall skills and ultimately defense if need be.
Okay.
And you also have to think about their families, their kids, their wives,
Exactly.
right? So
And if you can get
all
the
of this,
families on the property, that's where this works.
correct,
For the same reason, if you
correct,
have these mercenaries working for you, defending,
correct.
if they don't have family on that property, their
Or the
allegiance is
ability to
already
bring
wherever
them
they
to the
are.
property.
Yeah.
Yeah, or the ability to, so
Yeah.
that's the old castles, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Why
That's
were
exactly it.
defenders willing to fight for the castles?
Mhm.
Because they could bring their families into the castle, so they
Exactly.
would
Exactly.
be out of the line of fire. I mean, unfortunately, it sets you up for siege, etc.
Mhm.
We're not probably going to have to worry about that too much.
Yeah.
Although Ruby Ridge and other things.
Well, if there's a
Um,
lot of them happening at the same time, the federal
They
government
can't,
will not be
yeah,
able to deal with it.
no,
Period.
and mostly what you're going to deal with is the unaccountable, off the
Mhm.
books army that's the cartels and the terrorists.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was the global war on terror? The global war on terror is a hostile takeover by the US and European and British governments of
Yeah.
all the criminal organizations, including the terrorists of the world.
Yeah.
They now lock, stock, and barrel own them if they didn't outright create them.
Mm-hmm.
They've got their own funding in the form of trafficking, human and otherwise. So that's the real enemy.
Yeah.
And
that's another one that's been created. I mean, that's another one to distract people. Yeah.
Well, it's not just no. These are the ultimate armies of the financial religion.
Yeah.
Of the financialist.
Yeah.
Is outright slavery.
Yeah.
And the princes are trying to fight back, but they're trying to fight back in the same belief systems, concepts, and ideas as the financialist. How the hell are you going to do that?
So we're
You can
talking
do
about
it.
like the Elon Musks and those who are allied with him, who are trying
They
to
believe they can restore the system of the last 400 years, but that system is artificial. It was always artificial, and it's a religion.
Yeah.
It's
Because
a
they're from
religion.
that, and that's all they understand. They don't understand the prior.
Correct.
conditions
Correct.
in the world. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
And I've been
Yeah.
having this conversation with some elites, very elite, very wealthy families, and
Yeah.
they can't hear it. And they go to their gatekeepers, and so there's going to be some families that get it and some who make it and some who
So,
don't.
so
But
how, I mean, not being specific in what they're doing, but how are they preparing for the ones who get it? How are they preparing for it?
to be quite honest, I haven't heard a single one that gets it like to this degree
Yeah.
yet. To this degree yet.
I don't
Uh,
think they will just because they've had so many generations, just in the same way that we've been dumbed down and we've been pampered more so than every generation before us. I don't think you're going to get answers because the questions aren't there yet, and the questions only come from
Correct.
trauma.
The forcing function hasn't happened.
No.
Here's what happens in these transition periods where we go back, and I know we're going to pause here for a moment, but when the forcing function happens, what emerges are new princely families.
Hmm. Yeah. Who result from the trauma.
Who prepared in the right ways because they knew the real problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so they survive it. And then what happens is some of the big houses recognize in time and align with the right guys.
Yeah. I mean, you can look at like even
And
like what in English history, Plantagenet. There is no family line from that line. It's gone.
that's
And
not true.
it's
That's
not
actually
true?
not true. No, 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 no. The Plantagenets are still alive and well, and they live in Australia. It's the Duke of, I can't
Okay.
remember. No, no, the Plantagenets are still with us, and actually they have the better claim to the English throne.
Okay,
They have
so
the
if we go
last
even
legitimate.
further back, I'm just trying to find like lines of people who are no longer with us. We're talking about like during the Dark Ages or during the plagues,
Well, the
where
Plantagenets aren't in power anymore. That's
yeah,
another way of looking at it. The family's still with us.
yeah. But there have been families who have just been totally wiped out because they were
Correct.
not prepared for what had occurred during that time.
Correct. Well, all the noble houses. Look at all the noble houses that got wiped out in World War One.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
wiped out,
yeah,
gone.
yeah, yeah,
Right? Which
yeah.
is what that war was intentionally about.
Okay, okay. Well, thanks, EM. I want to keep this at 2 hours this time, just to get people to get their feet wet because this is some pretty deep stuff. And I know there's going to be a bunch of questions that people are going to be having that we'll be able to answer in the next talk. But I want to thank you again. Where are we going to send people for them to actually read your material and get your latest
Yeah.
news?
Go to X. EM Burlingame at X is probably Twitter is the best way. I do have a Substack. Um, I'm writing a novel that goes into all this very deep concepts very deeply, going back over 2,000 years. It's called As Rome Burns. It's emburlingame.substack.com. And that's a great place to go to get, in a entertaining, I hope, story fashion, a lot of these concepts and ideas in a much deeper way.
Great. Thank you. Thanks again, EM. We'll be talking soon.
Yep.